this computer, and we'll put it back. Oh, no, here. Okay. Topic is head covering for women and head covering for men. Okay, the only problem is I can't see you. What happened? Oh, it is. Okay. If you look in the Tanakh, in the Bible, I'll just read it for you. Okay, the first source is Genesis 24:65. 24:65. I'm trying to remember what it was myself. I can't even remember. 24:65. Here it is. 24. Oh, yeah, now I remember. There's a story of Yitzchak who is going to meet his bride to be. If you remember the story, Abraham's Eved, servant, goes to find a wife. And he comes to the well and he says, whatever girl comes to this well and says, I want to give you water and for your animals water, that's the one, God, that you have picked as a bride for Isaac. That's what we call don't try this at home. But that's what it says in Breshit. And then, of course, he comes to the well, and Rivka, who's a family member, of course, and related to Rivka, who's related to Abraham through his cousin Lavan and Betuel. So comes to the well. Now, Rivka is interested in joining the family of Abraham. According to the Midrash, she's a very young girl. Rashi claims she was 3 years old. Ibn Ezra says she was 12 years old. Whatever the point was, she was a young girl and she wanted to go, even though her parents asked if she was sure she wanted to go. Now, it says that Isaac went into the field in the afternoon, and he lifts up his eyes and he sees that camels are coming. And then Rivka lifts up her eyes and she sees Isaac, and she falls off the camel. Now, this is an interesting story. First of all, it's an interesting story to see the difference between Rebecca or Rivka and Isaac. Isaac's a very spiritual man. Remember what happened as a child. He's taken by his father to be an offering on Mount Moriah, which is what we call the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of
You went mute.
How about now? Am I okay? So in the story of the binding of Isaac, which is Genesis chapter 22, Breshit 22. So Avram is told to take his son, the one he loves, Isaac, and to bring him as an offering on the mountain which God will show. And in the end, Abraham is told not to take Isaac. Meaning he takes Isaac all the way to the mountain, binds him hands and legs, puts him on the altar, but then God says, the angel says, don't touch the boy, because I know that you're God-fearing. Instead, take that ram. And a ram appears miraculously, and he takes the ram and offers it instead of Isaac. But Isaac didn't hear the prophecy. He opens his eyes, and all of a sudden, Dad is taking a ram instead of him. For Isaac, this was a traumatic situation because he was willing to give his life with his belief in his father's nevuah, his father's prophecy. Anyhow, Isaac lives his life as a very internal person, a very spiritual and internal person. Even when he's going to have children of Esav and Yaakov, he cannot see anything wrong with Esav. He only sees the good in Esav. That's the type of person he is. He's able to go deep into somebody's soul and see all the good stuff. The bad stuff he hardly notices. It's like it's trivial for him. So this is Yitzchak, and he's walking. So it says here that he's walking in the field, and it says he lifts his eyes and he sees camels In other words, he doesn't see the pretty girl sitting on the camel. He only sees the camels. Now, it's not that she was far away, because as Rebecca says, the next verse, that she lifted her eyes and saw Isaac. So obviously they could see each other. Rebecca, which is a person who grew up in a family, a people family, so she looks to see who her chatan, who her husband is going to be. Isaac, it doesn't even occur to him. And she falls off the camel, which means, what does it mean to fall off the camel? She see, the Talmud says in Brachot that Isaac, when he was in that field, he was praying mincha. The Talmud learns the idea of praying mincha, the afternoon prayer, from Isaac in the field. So somebody once said, the Netziv of Volozhin said, well, Isaac must have been in the field. In antiquity, people used to raise their hands when they would pray. So there he is in the field like a breast liver, praying, raising his hands. And then Rivka, who comes from a very pagan background, even though she is not personally, but she's not used to having somebody so spiritual like that, she gets nervous, she falls off the camel. And then what does the next verse say? Where to go? Vatomer le'eved, then she said to the Abraham's servant, Mi ha'ish halazeh, who is that man who is walking in the field? Maybe it's not Isaac, she wasn't sure. And then the servant says, yes, that is my master. That's Isaac. And then it says that she took her handkerchief and she covered herself. Now, it's not clear what she covered. Did she cover her head or did she cover her face? It's not clear. Rashi says, what did she cover when she saw him? Vatitkas, it doesn't actually say. So Unklus says that she covered her eyes as an act of modesty. She covered her eyes. I used to work in the synagogue at Hebrew University on Mount Scopus. I was sort of like the synagogue rabbi there for 3 years. And we used to get all these tourist groups that would walk in. And people were not dressed so well in the summer, so I would put these kerchiefs, in the entrance so people could take them and put them over their shoulders, whatever. So this Christian group walks in, and they take the kerchief, and what do they put it? On their heads. Okay. It didn't occur to them that maybe over their shoulder. That wouldn't do. All of them put the kerchiefs on their head when they walked in. Yeah. So, yeah. So everybody has a different concept, of course, what these ideas mean. But this is the first place we find in the Bible the idea of a woman covering her upper, something connected to her head because of modesty. But as according to Unklus, she only covered her eyes, like they used to do in the Muslim countries where women would cover their faces. But it could be that she covered her head. It's not exactly clear. But for here, it's not clear. The second source I want to show you, where did it go again? Oh, moment. I think it disappeared on me. Yeah, sorry about that. Get it back in a second. Here. Let's try this. You get the space, you get one of, oh no, I have two of them here. What's that? Oh, I see, I see. Okay, so let's take a look at the next source. The next source is the book of Numbers, chapter 5:18. The book of Numbers, chapter 5:18. Bamidbar. So in Bamidbar, where are you? Here it is. Okay, so in Bamidbar, Numbers, what do we say? Chapter 5:18, I think it was. I'm going to use this for a long time. 5:18. Chapter 5:18. There's a story here about the disloyal woman, Isha Sota. If you want to see it, Numbers, if I can open it up for you. Numbers 5:18. There it is. There it is again. Okay, it's not it either. Sorry. Everything takes time here. There it is. This is called the story of Isha Hasota. And can you see it now? And God said to Moses, command the Israelites to send away from the camp. Yeah, that's not it, of course. Why would they do that? Not that either. Not that either. Either. Yeah, I'm having a hard time here. Let's try a different one. Okay. Verse 11. And God spoke to Moses. Can you see that? No? Can? Speaking to the children of Israel and say, if a man's wife goes aside and acts unfaithfully against him, and a man lie with her carnally, it be hidden from the eyes of her husband, she being defiled secretly, and there shall be no witnesses, neither shall be taken in act, because if there are no witnesses, you cannot punish anybody. But the spirit of jealousy came upon him, and he became jealous of his wife, and that she was defiled, or if the spirit of jealousy came upon him. Then shall the man bring his wife to the priest, and he brings an offering for her, the 10th part of an ephah of a barley meal, without any oil. And then the priest shall take the holy water in a vessel of the dust that's on the floor of the tabernacle. The priest shall say to the woman before God, and let the hair of the woman go down loose, and put the meal offering of memorial in her hands, etc. Then the woman has to swear that if no man lay with her, etc., then she drinks this water. Okay. Actually, the Talmud says if she drinks the water, she gets punished, and she did something wrong, she gets punished. If she drinks the water, she did nothing wrong, she gets a child. Anyhow, the point is in this story, it says that in order to disgrace the woman, he tells her to let her hair down. Which means that for a married woman to let her hair down was considered a disgrace in antiquity. There's an expression in English. When you want to feel more comfortable, you say, let your hair down. That's actually exactly taken from here. The idea of this woman letting her hair down means that she's actually being not proper. Letting your hair down today means, okay, loosen up. You don't have to be so tight all the time. But in antiquity, letting your hair down was considered something somebody did only at home when they went outside. Okay, now let me look at one last one you saw. Let's do this again. Share screen. Okay, so this one is taken from Yeshayahu, Isaiah 47:2. Yeshayahu 47:2. Let's see if I can find it. I can move you guys to the side. 47:2. It's not even here. No. Yeshayahu, Isaiah 47:2. 47. 2. Okay, Isaiah 47:2. Take the millstones and the ground flour. You see that? Take the millstones on the ground flour, pull off your veil, strip off your robe, uncover your legs, pass through the rivers, take heavy milestones, etc. In other words, Yeshayahu is saying, you have to see it in the context, really. I hate when they do it like that, one verse. Context is that they're doing the wrong thing. Of course, and give me the context. I only give you that one verse for some strange reason. See again. Take millstones and ground flour. Take off your veil. Lift up your skirt. Bare your legs and wade through the streams. Your nakedness will be exposed. Your shame will be uncovered. I will take vengeance. I will spare no one. But again, this idea of taking off your veil from your head is considered something which is modest in the antiquity. Okay, the last quote here is from Yeshayahu 3:17. Yeshayahu 3:17. See that one? Isaiah 3:17. 3:17. Therefore, the Lord will strike with a scab the heads of the daughters of Zion, and God will lay bare their secret parts. So this also this idea to remove, I don't know, I can't understand the English sometimes, unfortunately. Let me try again. Try another translation. Okay. Then God will bear sores on the heads of the daughter of Zion, and the Lord will make their foreheads bare. Some people say the scalp of the daughters of Zion and make their foreheads bare. Again, this idea of taking off the veil, which is also in the Bible. Now I'll go back to the page which I was looking at before with you. So share screen. So these were the first sources. These sources are specifically the source, the Sotav, the unfaithful wife, has this idea of letting the hair down. Now the question is it letting the hair down? Is it uncovering the hair? And is it something which is still pertinent today? For historical proof that this was practiced in early temple period, look at Maccabees 3, chapter 4, verse 6. And young women who just entered the bridal chamber, shared married life, exchanged joy for wailing, myrrh-perfumed hair sprinkled with ashes, and they were carried away, meaning by the soldiers of Antiochus, unveiled, altogether raising a lament instead of a wedding song. In other words, the soldiers would come, grab these married women, remove their headscarves, and take them away. Which another thing, another question is this just married? This was married women in general, it seems. Mishnah Sota 3:8. A man can let his hair down and rent his clothes if he is a leper, if he's a leprous. But a woman does not let her hair down or rent her clothes because it's considered immodest. Midrash and Bamidbar Rabbah. The ways of the daughters of Israel is to have their heads covered, and therefore the Kohen uncovers or unravels her hair, the Sota, and says to her, you have separated yourself from the ways of the daughters of Israel, cover their hair, here but hair, and walked in the ways of the daughters of the nations who uncover their hair. So here is what you wanted. What is the Mishnah and Sota? I'm going to show you a few sources and then discuss them, okay? Source 2. Nidarim. Mishnah says, he who takes a vow not to benefit from black-haired people may not benefit even from bald-haired people or gray-haired. Because when he means black-haired, it means all men. But he may benefit from women and children because only men are called black-haired, because women cover themselves with a veil, so you don't know what color their hair is. So the Talmud in Nedarim is bringing a Mishnah, really the Mishnah, from the Second Temple period, says when men are considered black-haired because the women have their hair covered, so nobody actually knows for their husbands the color their hair happens to be. Okay. Now, what is the reason, the Gemara asks? After all, he didn't say those who possess hair, so therefore it could even be a bald person. What does it mean they may benefit from women and children because only men are called black-haired? What's the reason? Men sometimes cover their heads and sometimes do not. This will be part of our discussion on whether a man has to cover his head. As you see, it says your men sometimes don't cover their head. But women's hair is always covered, and children are always bareheaded. Rabbeinu Nisim of Gerona, writing in the 13th century, says, in Mishnaic times, it was a universal practice for women's hair to be covered, and its violation was deemed sufficient ground for divorce without payment of the ketubah. In the present passage, it appears that no distinction was drawn between married and unmarried women. But later on, custom became more lenient with respect to unmarried women. In other words, if women in antiquity didn't cover their hair, the assumption was that even children, girls didn't cover their hair, then girls must have done so too. So the Rabbeinu Nisim of the 13th century said, eventually, girls stopped covering their hair. As for men, it was considered a sign of reverence and piety to cover their head much later on. Nevertheless, in the case of great scholars, it was held to be indispensable, which means men covered their hair when they thought they wanted to be specially reverent, but the scholars did it all the time. Okay, anybody following me so far? Let me summarize until this point. How do I do? Oh, stop share. Okay, we saw in the Bible that women, it seems, either veiled themselves or had their hair up. From the Sota, it seems that women had their hair up in some type of, I don't know what to call it, whatever you braid or pyramided or wherever you're doing. In Isaiah, it already seems that women had veils when they walked outside. By the way, this doesn't mean necessarily at home. When they walked into the street, it seems that they had veils. Now, the Mishnah picks up on this, and the Mishnah says that women in the Mishnaic times, at the end of the Second Temple, usually had their hair covered, and that's why men were called the black-haired people, and women were not, because nobody knew exactly what color their hair was. However, Rabbeinu Nisim of the 13th century says that even though in antiquity, even girls cover their head, that stopped at some point, and it became only married women and not unmarried women. But then the question is, if it's only married women, not married women, what exactly is the definition of covering your hair? If it's an act of modesty, what is the difference if you're married or not married? You can't say that because somebody's unmarried, okay, a 3-year-old baby can go without a bathing suit in the water and nobody really cares. But if it's a 23-year-old baby, so it's already making a statement. So just because they're not married, it doesn't matter if they are modest or not modest. What exactly does that mean? Or does head covering for a woman mean actually something different socially than regular modesty? Okay, let's go to the next one. The Talmud in Brachot 24. Rabbi Isaac said, even a handbreadth exposed in a married woman constitutes sexual excitement. Which way shall I say if one gazes upon it? By the way, I think this is any woman, by the way. Didn't Rabbi Shesha say, why did scripture enumerate the ornaments worn outside the clothes and inside? To tell you that if one gazes even the little finger of a woman, it's as if he gazed at her secret places. No, it means with one's own wife. And when he is reciting the Shema. Rabbi Chisa said, even a woman's leg is a sexual incitement. And etc. Some say even a woman's voice is sexual incitement. As it says, for your, how sweet is your voice, etc. in Shir Shirim. And Rabbi Shesha said even a woman's hair is such. Okay. So there's an interesting discussion in Brachot 24, which is actually about the laws of Kriyat Shema. If a person is reciting the Shema, you're not allowed to recite it where somebody is naked. What is the definition of naked? Is it completely naked? So the Talmud in Brachot says a few interesting things. It says, number one, naked means at least a handbreadth. At least a handbreadth. If it's less than a handbreadth, that's not naked. Doesn't it matter where the handbreadth is? Which is an interesting, the answer is yes, it does matter. But it has to do also with the concept of what they consider handbreadth, which I'll talk about. I don't know if I'm going to have time today because it gets a little bit complicated. But the interesting point here is when they're talking about the Shema, because the Talmud says, what are we discussing here? Talmud says reciting the Shema. The Talmud says all of a sudden the voices of a woman is considered immodest, and even the hair of a woman is immodest. And then the question is, are these discussions specifically about when a person is davening or saying the Shema, or is it in general? Which is a discussion which takes place in the 20th century, but not at this point. So anyhow, let me look at one more source and I'll tell you how halacha developed. And the last source I'm going to show you is also taken from the Gemara. It's not here, it's here. This is a Mishnah in Yoma. Sages said it to her. Oh, this is not a Mishnah, this is a Gemara. They said to a certain woman, what merit have you done that you earned that your 2 sons were high priests? She said, throughout the days of my life, the beams of my house never saw the plaits of my hair. And they said to her, but there were others who did likewise and did not succeed to have 2 sons who were high priests. In other words, she says she was very strict, but the beams of her house never saw her hair. Why is that being very strict? The assumption is that at home, women didn't cover their hair, only when they went out. But even this woman would cover her hair when she was at home. Okay, another one. Mishnah. Oh, I'm losing it again. Here it is. The Mishnah says, these are to be divorced without receiving the ketubah. A woman who transgresses the law of Moses or Jewish practice. Okay, so the Talmud wants to know, what's the difference between the law of Moses and Jewish practice? So let's go over here. What is deemed to be a wife's transgression against Jewish practice? The Talmud says going out with her uncovered head. Is this not a prohibition against Torah? Doesn't it say he shall uncover the woman's head? It was taught by the school of Rabbi Ishmael. There was a warning for the daughters of Israel that they should not go without an uncovered head. From the Torah, it's satisfactory if a woman is covered by her work basket, which is called a katla. But according to Jewish tradition, she's forbidden to go out even without covering her hair completely. Rabbi Asi, let me just explain what that means. The Talmud in Yoma says like this. There's a difference between the Torah requirement and the rabbinic requirement. When the Torah says that you should uncover, let down the hair of the sotah, it means that originally a woman's hair was supposed to be cropped on top of her head. So from the Torah's perspective, it's enough that she crops up her hair and she wears a katla. What's a katla? A katla was a sort of a see-through basket that a woman would put on the top of her hair to grab the bundle of hair. That was called a katla. And even though it was see-through, because of the fact that it grabbed the hair, that's enough from the Torah's perspective, because you're not letting your hair down. But the daughters of Israel took upon themselves to actually totally cover their hair, not only with a basket, but with some type of handkerchief. That's what happened in the Second Temple period, and that's why women in the Second Temple period were not the ones who were called the ones of black hair, because they constantly covered their hair. That was what happened. Okay? We continue. Rabbi Asi said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, with a basket on her head, being a katla, a woman is not guilty of going about as an uncovered head, meaning from the Torah, it is considered covered. In considering this statement, Rabbi Zera, who lived in Babylonia, pointed out a difficulty. Where is the woman assumed to be? If she's in the street, it may be objected this is already forbidden by Jewish practice. Which if she's in her courtyard, objection may be that if so, would not leave our father Abraham a single daughter who would remain with her husband, because you're going to say even in her house, in her courtyard, she has to cover her hair. Abai said, or it might be said, Rabbi Kahana replied, the statement refers to one who is walking from one courtyard into another by way of an alley, which means that according to this passage, in the house, woman doesn't have to cover her hair. In the courtyard, she also doesn't have to cover her hair, but when she goes from courtyard to a back alley, she needs to have her hair up at least in a mesh. And in a public street, it has to be covered rabbinically. That's what it seems from the Talmud. I don't know if you see that because I don't know if I opened it for you or not. Keep on. Did you see that? Oh, now you did. I'm sorry. I just can't tell sometimes. I'm going back and forth. Again, Rabbi Asi says, again, so this discussion between Rabbi Asi in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and both Rabbi Asi and Rabbi Zera in Babylonia, they're basically saying, Rabbi Asi said if a woman had this basket on her head, she is not liable because she did what's supposed to be done. And then Rabbi Zera said, well, what are you talking about? In the street, we already said rabbinically she's supposed to, or custom-wise, to cover everything. But if you're talking in her courtyard, of course, in her courtyard, in her backyard, she doesn't have to cover her hair, just like she doesn't have to cover her hair in the house. But if she's going, so he said, what we're talking about is she's going from her backyard, crossing an alley to somebody else's backyard, there, at least she should cover it with a katla. So what it seems is that in Babylonia, women covered their hair only when they walked outside and not when they came home. This was the opinion of Rabbi Soloveitchik, by the way, and the opinion of the whole Brisker line from Rav Chaim Alevi of Brisk. I know that because I have a third cousin who is married to a direct descendant of Rabbi Soloveitchik. So that way, that's how I know this. So, and when she's at home, she doesn't cover her hair. When she leaves the house, she does. So from this, it's in the house, no cover and hair can be down, in the courtyard as well, but going from courtyard to the back alley, hair has to be at least up in the mesh, and in a public street, rabbinically, which means Minhag Yisrael, she had to cover her hair. Now let's read the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says, in Orach Chaim, hair of a woman which is usually covered, who cannot recite the Shema in her presence. However, a bachelorette who goes with uncovered hair, normally, nobody can recite the Shema, one can recite the Shema in their presence. The Ramah says this includes the hair which flows from her braids. As a lot of girls used to braid her hair. Again, the Bach and Even Ezer, the daughters of Israel shall not go with their hair untied in the market, whether married or unmarried. However, the Bach explains that uncovered and says it's only referring to a divorcee. But normally, a young girl does not even have to braid her hair. Rabbi Yaakov Emdin, writing in the 18th century, was among a number of rabbis who disapproved of the wearing of wigs, even declaring that the reading of Shema in the presence of a woman wearing a wig was prohibited. On the other hand, Rabbi Moshe Isserlich, 16th century, in the Shulchan Aruch, in his notes of the Shulchan Aruch, declared that a wig was acceptable, and his lenient ruling was eventually accepted by Ashkenazic Jewry. Let me explain. When Jewish women covered their hair and were very strict about it, non-Jewish women also covered their hair. Until the 18th century, or possibly until the 17th century, and maybe even a little bit earlier, but I would say until the 17th century, non-Jewish women covered their hair, both in Muslim countries and in Christian countries. You can see this in place in Slavic countries right up to the beginning of the 20th century. You can still see grandmothers in the Ukraine, in Russia, going around with covered hair, in Romania, in Bulgaria, definitely in Turkey. But even places of Christian countries, this is the way it was. It was this way in Scandinavia, probably until the middle of the 19th century, among religious women. Correct me if I am wrong. And because the Christians understood that covering the hair, just like we understood it, was an act of modesty. Let me show you. Let's look at the bottom for a moment. I'll jump over. This is a quote from the New Testament, the book of Corinthians. don't even know what that means. It's 1:11:5. There's a Christian. There it just says it's a source that women were told to cover their hair. Corinthians 11:5. They bring us as a historical proof in the late Second Temple times that women used to cover their hair. We know that, of course, from the Mishnah. I didn't actually bring the source. So, why all of a sudden is there an argument as early as the 17th century whether a woman is allowed to wear a wig? Why would a woman wear a wig? Can anybody think of the reason? Especially since the wigs looked awful at the beginning. Today, it's like, looks better than your own hair. But in those days, why would a woman want to wear a wig in the 17th century? If you had to guess. Not everybody at the same time, just like one person. You have an idea? Unmute yourselves and tell me what you think. It's logical. Okay. Well, let's make it easier. Why would a woman want? I can't hear you, Elizabeth, because I think you're muted. Are you talking to me or talking to somebody else? Maybe you're talking to somebody else. Oh. But what happened? Oh, I got it. Okay. Yeah. I still can't hear you. Oh, try again. I don't know. Look it up. Oh. No, it's not working. I'm sorry. Let's see if I can do it. No, you're unmuted, but I don't hear you. Okay. Anyhow, I'm sorry. So I just put it like this. Obviously, Jewish women, as they were getting to countries where non-Jewish women were not covering their hair, they were feeling different. And nobody likes feeling different. And what's worse is when you have a situation where the young women are not covering their hair, the old ones are, so that means you're looking like the old woman. So the development of the wig, I assume, was women who wanted to look like the non-Jewish women who were not covering their hair, but at the same time wanted to cover it, so they started wearing wigs. That's what I assume. That's why the wig developed basically in European countries, Eastern European countries, and then Western European countries, but European countries. So we're talking about basically Greater Poland of the 18th and 19th of the 18th century. Those are the areas where it begins. And there's an argument about the wig, but remember, in those days, the wig sort of looked like a wig because very often it was horsehair. So in the early wigs, so I guess it was relatively easy to see. Okay, I want to continue so I said there was an argument between Jacob Emdin and the Ramah whether a wig was acceptable. By the early 20th century, Rabbi Yechiel Epstein, who wrote a book called Aruch HaShulchan, which was a very popular book in Jewish halacha at the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, deplored the lack of observance of head covering among women, already claiming that the majority of women were violating its observance. However, cognizant of his most unhappy reality, he makes it clear that it is permissible to pray in the presence of a woman whose hair is uncovered. In his Aruch HaShulchan, he states, "Let us now decry the tragic circumstances that have befallen us in the generation. Jewish women have become lax and now appear in public with their hair uncovered. According to the law, it appears to me that it is permissible, though, for a man to recite Devarim Shebikdusha, holy things in their presence. Rabbi Epstein's ruling was sociologically motivated by an environment in which the practice of head covering was no longer widely accepted or observed. Societal mores led some rabbis to make a lenient stance towards head covering. Rabbi Yeshua Bavad, 1754 to 1838, wrote that the matter depends on the general local practice. Jewish women should do as other women in their locale. If the women of the region are not accustomed to going with head covering, then the Jewish women do not have to be considered immodest if they do not cover their hair. There were other rabbis who also tolerated uncovered hair. Rabbi Joseph Mashash, who was the uncle of Rav Shalom Mashash, the late chief rabbi of Jerusalem, when he was in Meknes in Morocco, he wrote that a woman who is living in Morocco in the areas where the non-Jewish women under French occupation are not covering their hair, they also don't have to. And Rabbi Gershuni, who was living in the United States, also was lenient towards this issue. Both Rabbi Mashash and Gershuni specifically rule that modern Jewish women do not have to cover their hair. You probably never heard this before. Rabbi J.B. Horowitz, 1868 to 1935, was particularly energetic in his support of Jewish women who chose to uncover their hair, a position for which he drew considerable criticism. Horowitz defended both innovations of the wig, which he considered ugly, and the bareheaded because he claimed that societal changes led to a change in Jewish custom. Following the same line of reasoning as Rabbi Bavad, he argued that in a place where it's acceptable to cover the hair, a woman going against the accepted custom is still regarded as immodest. Men in such place are unaccustomed to seeing a woman's hair. But in this instance, there's no difference between a married and unmarried woman. They should all cover their hair. But concerning unmarried girls, Horowitz introduces various rabbinic sources attesting that they can go with uncovered hair. The practice of unmarried girls there also depends on the custom of the place. Okay, what's going on here? Let me explain. This is something that most people won't tell you. But I want you to understand how it evolved. By the 19th century, most religious women in Greater Poland, Jewish women, were not covering their hair. Even among the Lithuanians, and sometimes the rabbis' wives as well. Sometimes. Among the Hasidim, they did. This continued well into the 20th century, up to the Second World War and past. Among Ashkenazi women, it became very lenient because Ashkenazic women living in what we call Eastern Europe and Middle Europe were living in places where women were not covering their hair. So women living in, as I said, Greater Poland and probably the Ukraine and parts of Russia, and we're talking about Orthodox women, and in places like Romania and Hungary, which were not Hasidic. In the Hasidic places, they all cover their hair, not a question. I'm talking about the non-Hasidic places, or in the large cities specifically, because in the villages, the women covered their hair. If a person was living in Transylvania and Romania, where all women covered their hair in the villages, the Christian women, so the Jewish women did the same. That's obvious. But I'm saying the ones who live in the big cities, whether you're talking about Warsaw, Krakow, Bucharest, Budapest, the large cities where women were not covering their hair, the Jewish women stopped covering their hair too. Now, how long did this happen? So I'll tell you a few stories. I was trying to figure out exactly when the turnover came back again. I went to this, it was Pesach about 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. And it was in the, near Mont Tremblant, just outside Montreal, in the Laurentian Mountains. There was a hotel that was kosher for Pesach, and there was a rabbi who came in from New York. He was a Hasidic rabbi who actually wrote a book on the of Shira Gaon's letter. And he was there with his aunt, who was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, survivor of the Shoah. So his aunt gave a talk, and towards the end of Shabbat. It was the end of the Chag, really. And after an inner talk, she said, the last time she saw her mother during the war, her mother said to her, if we get split up, I want you to promise me two things. Number one, that you will tell your story, though you'll write a book about what happened to you, and that you'll always cover your hair. That's what her mother made her promise. So I went over this woman after and I said, I want to understand something. Why did your mother ask you specifically to cover your hair? Is that because other religious women were not covering their hair? So she said to me, I'll tell you exactly. She said, I was in the first Beis Yaakov in Krakow. Beit Yaakov was the Haredi women's school, which was started in 1933 in Krakow. She said, I was in Beit Yaakov in Krakow, but I had grown up in a Hasidic community in Warsaw. Said, in our Hasidic community in Warsaw, women did exactly like they do in Meir Sharim today. They had a wig, and on top of the wig, they had a hat. Exactly like when you look in Meir Sharim, or when you go to Williamsburg in New York in the Hasidic communities, or even in Brooklyn, the Hasidic communities. When I came to Krakow, she says, I would see a Hasid with a shtreimel and kapota, and his wife did not cover her hair. And they were walking on Shabbat. Says that I never saw among Hasidim in Warsaw, but I did see it when I was in Krakow. So I said to her, what about the Litvaks, meaning the non-Hasidic Orthodox Jews? She says, oh, their women never cover their hair. So, in other words, she was saying that between the wars already, the Orthodox women among the non-Hasidim were not covering their hair. And but the Hasidic women, by and large, when they lived in large groups, they were covering their hair. Another story. I once had a meeting with Rabbi Naftali Lavi. Rabbi Naftali Lavi was the older brother of Rabbi Israel Lau, who was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv and used to be the chief rabbi of Israel. Naftali Lavi passed away about 10 years ago, and I was able to meet with him one time. And this was after, maybe it was 8 years ago, I can never remember because of Corona. And I remember I said to him, tell me something, you're from Krakow. I want to know if this woman's story, I told him the story about this woman I had met in Tremblant in the Adirondack Mountains. I want to know if it's correct for what he remembers as a child. So Naftali Levi said to me the exact same thing. He said among the Litvaks, the women never covered their hair. Among the Hasidim, many of them did. That's what he said, the exact same thing. And then, there's a story, by the way, Rabbi Dov Berch Soloveitchik, who was the head of Yeshiva University. So Rabbi Soloveitchik had come, he was born, of course, in Lithuania. He went to university in Germany, and of course had to run away before the war. And he came to the United States, and he was asked to be the head of Yeshiva University, where he stayed to the end of his life. And he met a girl when he was a young man studying in the university, an Orthodox girl from Germany, Tanya, who later became his wife. And they got married. Tanya never covered her hair, his wife. And one time I heard a story that one of the students said to Rabbi Soloveitchik, how come your wife doesn't cover her hair? Which is a bit of a chutzpah, but that's what happened. And he said, she doesn't want to. What am I going to do? Doesn't want to. So, but that's basically what happened in those days, that among the Orthodox, it became well known that among the Jews in Greater Poland and definitely in Western Europe, the women stopped covering their hair. There's another interesting support for this. There's a book by the Ben Ish Chai, which he writes in Iraq. Ben Ish Chai passed away in 1910. And he has a book about women's halachot. Ari, I see you want to ask a question. I'll get back to you in a moment. So he writes in his book of women's halachot. He says, I know, he says, that women living in European countries, I mean, Jewish women in European countries are not covering their hair anymore, but they do their way, we do our way. So we all cover our hair here. So whatever they do, but we all cover our hair. That's chapter 17, his book on the laws of women, but I forget the name of the book at the moment. It's been a while since I saw it. But it's interesting corroboration to see that he was aware in 1910, he passed away in 1910, That's exactly what was going on in Europe at the time. And that's why Rabbi Epstein, the Aruch HaShulchan, is lamenting that women stopped covering their hair. When I first saw that in the yeshiva, I thought he was talking about non-religious women. Then I only later that I realized he was talking about Orthodox women, not the non-religious ones. By the way, the Shulchan Aruch have a commentary called the Mishnah Brura. The Mishnah Brura is written by Israel Meir Cohen, who passed away in 1935 in Lithuania. So he also writes in the laws of Kriyat Shema. He says, if you said Kriyat Shema and a woman is not covering her hair, you don't have to say it again. However, he adds that a woman still has to cover her hair. He's just saying that if you did and she wasn't covering her hair, you don't have to. But he says, I know there are other people who have different opinions, but you cannot change the law. A woman must cover her hair. The Mishnah Brura writes in Lithuania. So, but you can see the struggle that was going on in Lithuania at the time with this issue. And I assume that the men did not want to force their wives to do something they didn't want to do. That's what probably happened. What happened was, though, after the Shoah, you have, of course, a break in tradition. And a break also means forgetting what actually happened. If you know that after the Shoah, there was major secularization within the Jewish world, all over. It started much before. It just started between the wars, but it continued in a heavy way after the Shoah. It took a while for the rabbinic world to get its act together, especially in places like the United States and Canada and Australia and South Africa and England, etc., and France. France even went through episodes because of the Algerian Revolution. And it took a while for the Orthodox community to set itself up in the United States. It was only with the influx of rabbis after the Shoah to the United States that Orthodoxy was able to get itself underway. I mean, the institutions were set up between the wars, even in the 1920s. But I would say Orthodox Judaism was really sidelined until after the Shoah, when major influxes of Jews coming from after the Shoah brought also rabbis who were trying to reestablish their institutions in the United States, like yeshivot. The comeback of Orthodoxy is in the 1970s, where for the first time in North America, you have a young generation who is going to yeshiva, not just day school, which started in the 1960s. Day schools in the United States started in the 1960s. Yeshivot become more popular by the 1970s. And there's like a renewed desire to study Jewish sources. The generation of the 70s and the 80s that produces for the first time young Orthodox people who are interested in the sources again brings back the head covering, where women are told that the head covering was lost, but this is what halacha says. And then you see all of a sudden a new generation of yeshiva people with women covering their heads. When the women cover their heads, then the grandmothers who are embarrassed start covering their hair too, which they didn't do before the war. So this is something interesting. And in Israel specifically, this happened even more than outside of Israel, because outside of Israel today, you'll see a lot of more modern Orthodox women who only cover their hair when they go to the synagogue or make blessings or do birkat hamazon at the house or at the Shabbat table. But in Israel, it's much more accepted that Orthodox women cover their hair in some fashion. The ones who are more religious will have a full hair covering or a wig. The ones who are a little bit more modern, let's say, they'll wear some symbolic thing in their hair. I don't know what to call it exactly. They'll tie something or whatever. So, but I mean, in Israel, it did have a comeback in that way, especially among the women who studied in yeshivot or seminaries, or whose husbands studied in yeshivot. There was actually a big comeback in Israel from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s about head covering. So I wanted to point this out, which means I'm going to summarize this in my perspective now. Is everybody here? Because a lot of people, you don't have your video on, so I can't tell if you're here if I'm talking only to half the group. Shalom, shalom. So I would say like this. Yes, Jewish law says a woman's supposed to cover her hair. It does say that. And by the way, according to the law, you have to cover all your hair except for up to one head breadth. That's according to the Talmud, which means if a woman covers her hair until here, let's say, and this is sticking out, that actually doesn't matter. It's less than a hand breadth. Question is whether it can be the front and the back, but I'm just saying, only according to the Zohar, those who follow the Zohar, they try to cover everything. But officially, according to Jewish law, one hand breadth. I know for many people this is difficult. So I just want to say, for those who find it difficult, I think it's important to say that there are opinions that say that in modern times, a woman who does not cover her hair, it's not a terrible thing. And I want to say this because I don't want a person to think that because they're not covering their hair, they're not religious to anything. Because Israelis are all or nothing. I think I told you the story one time. My mother was in the Sar El program. Sar El program, volunteers for the Israeli army. And my mother was not a young woman when she went to this program. She was in her 70s at the time. And they had a young madricha from Tveria. And she was talking to this madricha, and the madricha said she was from a secular family. But as my mother was talking to this madricha, she found out that the madricha keeps kosher, she keeps Shabbat. She said, I don't understand. You told me you're from a secular family, but you keep kosher, you keep Shabbat. From where I come from, that's not called secular. The girl says, yeah, but I wear pants. See, what happens is you do one thing which others consider not good, and you feel you must call yourself secular. The problem, if you call yourself secular, you're going to give up everything because, hey, you're secular, right? So it's very important for a person to, if they feel, I can't do this, it's difficult for me, you should know that there are opinions which are lenient. That's all I'm saying. So, but even according to the lenient opinions, when you go to Beit Knesset on Shabbat, at the meal, Zmirot, Brachot, Limud Torah, all these places, you're supposed to cover your head in any case. Okay, so I just wanted to say that. And even though I grew up in Israel, in the social milieu where all the women cover their hair, but I am aware that there are other opinions. And it's important to make sure that people who are entering for the first time realize that I want to make sure that in a month or two, you'll also feel comfortable after you pass the Beit Din, and not just when you're passing the Beit Din. That's why when I teach halakha, I also teach the more strict opinions and the more lenient opinions on purpose, because a person has to find their way, and they have to find their way within. And so if it's just a question of the lenient opinion, if that'll keep you in the fold, that's fine. I mean, it's like sometimes you see these women on what I call the religious kibbutzim, which are also quite interesting. They wear pants, but they cover their hair. So I don't know which one's more important, wearing a skirt or covering your hair, but they decided, and that's what they do. Okay, so I find these things interesting. Okay, go for a few more minutes. Want to take a break now or a little bit later? Up to you. So I have to talk about men's head covering, then talk about the 4 fast days. Okay, I'll talk about men's head covering and then we'll take the break. Okay. Do you see the page? Any questions? Oh, Ari, you want to ask a question, right?
Yeah, I just had a question about, you said Rabbi Soloveitchik's wife didn't wear a head covering?
That's correct, except when she went to synagogue.
Oh, so was she like ostracized in any way? Because I mean, that's to be the partner, like the
I'll tell you why she was not, because in her time, that was very accepted. Look, I have a relative who is Haredi, who lives in Beit Shemesh. He studied in yeshiva in Baltimore. The family actually was from Miami. Then he went to study in Israel. He lives in Beit Shemesh. He calls himself American Haredi. His father went to Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, which is a Haredi yeshiva, which allows the boys to study evening classes in Johns Hopkins. His father, who came to that yeshiva right after the Second World War, says that when he went to that yeshiva, the only ones who wore the hats were the rabbis, not the students. Today in the Haredi yeshivas, all the students wear hats from the age of 13. He says it was only the rabbis in those days who were wearing the hats. And he became a rabbi. He became a rabbi in Perth Amboy and in North Miami Beach. And in most of his working life, he worked as a rabbi. His wife only covered her hair on Shabbat. I'm talking about the father of this. Obviously, the one in Beit Shemesh, his wife covers her hair all the time. But I'm just saying this is the difference between the generations. They had gotten used to it in the Lithuanian, what we call Orthodox world, and they didn't see it as such a big deal. But today, people were taught differently. So that's why they see it differently. So because it is Jewish law, obviously, if you're doing it, it's better. But I just want people to realize if they're not doing it, they're not terrible. That's all I'm saying. In places where women are, other women are not. That's all I'm trying to say here. Because I know that it's a very sensitive topic. And as a man, it's very hard for me to tell a woman what to do. So in these issues. In general, by the way, tzniut is something that starts from inside. It's the way you see yourself standing before God and others. Because you can be completely dressed modestly and not be a modest person. It's what comes out of your mouth sometimes will have a very big effect. So, yeah. I want to talk about the kippah, or covering for men. This is also an interesting issue, head covering for men. I'll send you this page on WhatsApp if you want. Head covering for men. As we saw before, the Mishnah says, and the Mishnah, remember, the latest Mishnah was written in the year 200. The Mishnah says that men are called those of blackheads, meaning they had hair. And the Mishnah says because men did not normally cover their hair. Okay? So the Mishnah says specifically that men did not normally cover their hair. So that means that Jewish men did not normally cover their hair during the time of the Mishnah, which means until the end of the 2nd century. Rav Huna says in the name of Rabbi Joshua, this is in Babylonia, I receive my reward because I never walked 4 cubits without my head uncovered. So in the Talmud Shabbat, Rav Huna says, I did something special. I always covered my head. By the way, covering the hair here is not an act of modesty, but is an act of humbleness before God. With a woman also, it's an interesting question. In what sense is it modesty? Because obviously, in Jewish law, a woman is not supposed to wear a bathing suit in public. So how come a woman who is not married doesn't have to cover her hair? So obviously, it was a different concept of modesty. It was what I would call being more formal. Than a married woman, it was expected from her to be more formal. That's why she had to cover her hair when she went out of the house, but not when she was in the house. Because in the house, she did not have to be more formal. But when she walked out, by the way, I can tell you that in Europe, all the way to the 20th century, when a man left the house, he had to put on a hat. It was considered disrespectful for a man not to put on a hat when they left the house. That was European way of understanding. And European women, when European was more Christian, was the same when they left the house. So it's not unusual that this would have happened among the Jewish world too. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi lives early 3rd generation in the land of Israel, says, it is prohibited for a person to walk even 4 cubits with an upright posture. It means looking arrogant, your head high. Because it says the entire world is full of his glory. Gemara relates that Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, did not walk 4 cubits even with an uncovered head. He used to say, the divine presence is above my head and I must act respectfully. So it's interesting. The Talmud says you're not allowed to walk 4 cubits in arrogance, but it says that about a certain person that he didn't walk 4 cubits without his head covering. So it sounds like you're not supposed to walk at all being arrogant, but head covering, it's a special merit if you do. but it doesn't look like an obligation. The Talmud in the Shabbat says there was a Chaldean or astrologer who said to Rab Nachman bar Yitzchak's mother, "Your son will be a thief." Meaning he saw in astrology her son would be a thief. She didn't allow him. So what she did was she didn't allow her son to uncover his head. She said to her son, "Cover your head so that the fear of heaven will be upon you, and pray for divine mercy." He didn't know why she said this to him, because she was told. One day he was sitting and studying beneath a palm tree. It did not belong to him. And his cloak fell off his head because he didn't wear a kippah in those days. They wore like a cloak. He lifted up his eyes and saw the palm tree. He was overcome by the impulse. He climbed up and detached a bunch of dates with his teeth. Then, in other words, he had this inclination, but because he was acting very humbly by covering his head all the time, most of the time it kept him away from his inclination. That's what the story. In other words, it's a good thing to cover your head, but it's not an obligation. However, Rambam writes in the laws of prayer, one should not stand in prayer with his money belt. One should not be bareheaded in prayer, or even uncover his legs. If it's a place where people wear long pants before important people. This is also brought down in the Shulchan Aruch. But wait a sec. So Rambam says a person should not have their head bareheaded during tefillah, during prayer. In other words, if it's not an obligation to cover your head, but at least during prayer, you should cover your head because during that time, we want to feel humble before God. However, the Shulchan Aruch of Joseph Caro writes, it is prohibited to walk with an upright posture, and one should not walk even 4 cubits with a bare head. So the Shulchan Aruch, Joseph Caro in the 16th century, for the first time writes that a Jew should have their hair covered all the time. This was the first time. Also, there are those who say what is prohibited is said God's name with a bare head, and there are those who say you should not allow them to enter the synagogue bareheaded. So he acknowledges that people normally cover their head when they went into the synagogue or said God's name in a blessing. But in his opinion, a person should cover their head all the time. The Magen Avraham on the Shulchan Aruch, writing in the 17th century, says that what the Shulchan Aruch writes, that one should not go 4 cubits bareheaded, this was only the way of the saintly, not everybody. In other words, he disagrees with the Shulchan Aruch. It says it's only saintly people who cover their head all the time. Regular people, they cover their head when they pray, meaning men, when they pray and they say brachot. Berhetev says, in the name of Shlomo Luria, the Marshal of the 16th century, he wrote that is written not to go with an upright posture or with a bare head is referring to walking outside the house. But in the house, no. Which means the Marshal says that even what the Shulchan Aruch says that you should not go bareheaded, that's only out of the house. Inside the house, you don't have to cover your head. The Vilna Gaon, his Piskei Agra says, there is no prohibition to walk bareheaded except in front of important people or during prayer. And then it is correct for one's head to be covered. The saintly who stand before God, they cover their heads all day long. Now, I want to tell you something else that maybe you didn't know. Hasidic Jews seem to cover their hair all the time in Ashkenazi countries. Jews who lived in areas where the men always walked outside with their head covering also covered their hair all the time. However, when Jews started living in countries where the men were not covering their heads all the time, they also didn't cover it all the time. The same thing Jews who lived in Morocco, which was under the French conquest in the early 20th century. Not everybody covered their head all the time because the non-Jews were not covering their head all the time either. And because in the Shulchan Aruch, even though the Shulchan Aruch said you had to go all the time with your head covered, but not everybody agreed with the Shulchan Aruch. And in practice, I've seen pictures of Moroccan rabbis without their head covered at the beginning of the 20th century in a picture at a friend of mine's house, whose father was a famous Dayan in Morocco. So I'm just saying that, but I'll tell you what happened though, and this is very interesting. Jews, religious Jews who came to Israel, started covering their head full time. because they didn't understand why not. It wasn't just the Hasidim. Religious Jews in Israel started feeling that we should cover our head all the time because we're in a Jewish state. It's really Zionism that I would say revived the kippah as a 24/7 concept, except when you're sleeping, as a 24/7 concept among religious men. Outside of Israel, to this day, you have a lot of Orthodox men who don't wear a kippah all the time. I can tell you that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was the posek in the United States until he passed away in the early 80s, he wrote in one of his tshuvot, said if an Orthodox Jew is working in a non-Jewish company and they don't like the idea of his wearing a kippah at work because it stigmatizes them, he doesn't have to wear a kippah at work. Very specifically. I had a friend who was very religious when he worked for, forget the name of the company. He worked for Lever Brothers in the United States, New York City. He didn't cover his head. When he came home, he put on kippah. So, and this was accepted. There are a lot of religious Jews who do that. When they leave, sometimes at work, they put on a hat. By the way, most Haredi Jews in New York City, when they go around with a hat outside, not necessarily with a kippah, unless they're in a Jewish area. So, but I was saying that in Israel, there was a real renaissance of the kippah. And because there was such a renaissance on the kippah, there are even different kippah. The kippah almost describes what group you associate yourself with in Israel today. There's knitted kippah, and there's black kippah, and then there's a Sephardic kippah from the shuk, and then there's black knitted kippah, and then there's white kippah. I'm just saying that sometimes the kippot have even become different religious communities, but the kippah has really had a total revival in the state of Israel, and I see this as a positive thing. I know people in Tel Aviv specifically who do keep Shabbat, do keep kosher, sometimes come to our synagogue on Frischman, sometimes to go to the other synagogues in Ben Yehuda, who don't wear kippah during the week, but do on Shabbat. I don't judge anybody. I know that they don't want to be labeled. I got it. But I would say in general, in Israel, people have already understood that when you wear a kippah, there are different people with different opinions. So I don't think you have to worry about such things. That's my personal opinion, but hey, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. So but in general, I say that, you don't have to be afraid of it. Sometimes the kippah has a good influence. However, I can tell you that in my own personal experience, I've always wondered if it's a good thing for a Jew to wear a kippah all the time outside of Israel. Because when you wear a kippah outside of Israel, you have to be on your best behavior all the time, or else somebody's going to curse the Jews. So you have to be very careful about that. If you have a problem with that and you feel bad about it, then wear a baseball cap or something like that. I remember one time I'm driving the car in Montreal. A good friend of mine who grew up there, he's religious, but he doesn't wear a kippah. I always wear a kippah there, or a hat. So I'm driving the car, and this guy swerves in. I didn't see him. He almost hits me. And to deke out from me, he has to go into the sidewalk. So my friend says to me, take off your kippah. I don't want him to see that you're Jewish. I said, come on. He said, obviously, in another car, it's not a big deal. But I understand the problem. The Jews sometimes are afraid outside of Israel that you'll be labeled. So you have to do the right thing all the time, because people have a tendency, especially when you are designated Jewish, that you now represent the Jewish people. So if you're going to do that and not wear a baseball cap or something like that, be very careful. And remember, you are representing the Jewish people where you are. So in Israel, people know that people are people. But outside of Israel, anyhow, that's what I wanted to say. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then I will talk about the 4 somot, 4 fast days. Okay? I'll just put this on. I'm turning back on the recording now. I would like to talk about the 4 fast days, which culminate with the 9th of Av. And what happens if the temple gets built? Do we still fast? Okay. So let me show you some sources about this. Any questions about the previous thing, or shall I just go on? It is. 4 fast days over Jerusalem. Are they temporary? That is the topic. So first of all, what are the 4 fast days over Jerusalem? In the book of Kings, chapter 2, in the 9th year of his reign, meaning of Tzidkiyahu, the last king of Judah, on the 10th day of the 10th month, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia moved against Jerusalem with his whole army. He besieged Jerusalem. They built towers against it all around. The city continued in a stage of siege until the 11th year of King Tzidkiyahu. So on the 10th day of the 10th month, there was a siege around Jerusalem. What do we call that today, the 10th day of the 10th month? What is the 10th month? When you count from Nisan, it is Tevet. So the 10th day of the 10th month is Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet. And we commemorate this until this day. It's a fast day. And it's when the Babylonians made a siege around Jerusalem. That's fast day number 1. Fast day number 2. And then on the 9th day of the 4th month, if you count from Nisan, 4th month is Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz. Tammuz is the 4th month. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine had become acute in the city. There was no food left for the common people. And then the wall of the city was breached. All the soldiers left the city by night through the gate, through the double walls, which is near the king's garden. The Chaldeans, which worked with the Babylonians, were all around the city. The king set out for the Arava, the flatlands. The Chaldean troops pursued the king Tzidkiah, overtook him in the steps of Jericho, and forced him, and there they left him scattered. Captured the king, his entire force. They captured the king, brought him before the king of Babylonia. They put him on trial. They slaughtered Tzidkiyahu's sons before his eyes. They took out his eyes, and he was changed in bronze fetters and brought to Babylon. So, again, this is the 9th day of the 4th month. There was a famine in the city, and they broke the walls. The 9th day of the 4th month. The 4th month is Tammuz. It's the 9th of Tammuz. But wait a sec. That's not what we commemorate. What is the second fast day that we commemorate? The 10th of Tevet, and then
17th of Tammuz.
17th of Tammuz. So the Talmud says that the 17th of Tammuz is when the Romans breached the walls of Jerusalem in the Second Temple period. In the First Temple was the 9th. In the Second Temple was the 17th. Why did they move it to the 17th? Number one, it was more actual because this is what happened in their times. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, they breached the walls on the 17th of Tammuz. And secondly, it's also the day that Moses broke the tablets. So there was multiple reasons to have the 17th day of Tammuz. The day that Moses broke the tablets and the day that the Romans breached the walls of the Second Temple. Okay, let's keep going. Then on the 7th day of the 5th month is Av, 7th of Av, in the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, chief of the guards, the officer of the king came to Jerusalem. He burned down the house of the Lord, and the king's palace, and the houses of Jerusalem, and every notable person's house. The remnant of the people left in the city, defectors who are gone to the king of Babylon, etc. So here it says on the 7th day of Av, commemorate the 9th. However, in Jeremiah, it actually says it was the 10th day. 32 here. In the 9th year of his reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, King Nebuchadnezzar moved against Jerusalem with his whole army. They besieged it and put towers against it. So in one place it says the 7th of Av, another place it says the 10th. So why do we commemorate the 9th? So the Talmud says, on the 9th of Av is when the fire started in the temple. And on the 10th of Av, the fire stopped in the temple, meaning the temple burned from the 9th to the 10th. The 7th was when the houses of Jerusalem were being burned. So he burned down the houses of Jerusalem from the 7th. The temple burned from the 9th to the 10th, and we commemorated on the 9th. That's what the Talmud says about those dates. And then there's one more date, which is the fast of Gedalia. You can see this before. In the 7th month, which is Tishrei, Ishmael, the son of Netanya, son of Elishama, who is of royal descent, came with 10 men and struck down Gedalia, who was the leader in charge of the people after the destruction of the temple, and Gedalia died. And they also killed the Judeans and the Chaldeans who were present with him at the Mitzvah. So the fast of Gedalia is because Gedalia was actually killed in Rosh Hashanah. He was the leader of the Jews after the destruction of the temple, appointed by the Babylonians, killed by another Jew. And this happened on Rosh Hashanah, but we commemorated the day after Rosh Hashanah, which is the 3rd of Tishrei. So we have 4 fast days about the temple. 10th of Tevet, the siege around Jerusalem. 17th of Tammuz, we're in the 2nd temple period. They broke the walls of Jerusalem, and the first temple is on the 9th. The 9th of Av, which according to the Torah, at least the Tanakh, it goes from the 7th till the 10th. Book of Kings mentions the 7th. Jeremiah mentions the 10th. So the Talmud says that it's when the 9th of the fire started in the temple. And then the Tzom Gedalia, the fast of Gedalia, when Gedalia was assassinated by this Ishmael ben Netanya on Rosh Hashanah, and we commemorated the day after Rosh Hashanah on the 3rd of Tishrei. These are the 4 fast days. Also say, the Talmud says that both temples were destroyed on the 9th of Av, which would be another reason to have it specifically on the 9th. Are they temporary? I'll bring you the first source that seems to mention them as being temporary. This is the book of Zechariah, chapter 8, verse 19. Now remember, Zechariah lives at the beginning of the 2nd temple period. He lived at the end of the Babylonian exile, and he lived into the beginning of the 2nd temple period. He was able to see the temple. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, the last prophets, and all 3 of them see the 2nd temple rebuilt. Zechariah says, this is what the Lord of the host says. The fast of the 4th month, which is the fast of Tammuz, the fast of the 5th month, which is Tisha B'Av, the fast of the 7th month, which is Tzom Gedalia, the fast of the 10th month, Asara B'Tevet, will become occasions for joy and gladness. Happy festivals for the house of Judah. You must love honesty and integrity. So, it says that the fast may become times of happiness and jubilation. So we can already assume that that's what happened in the 2nd temple period. When they built the 2nd temple, the fast must have been abolished, because that's what Zechariah says. I'm also going to assume that even if they fasted on the 10th of Tevet, in Tammuz, they probably fasted on the 9th of Tammuz, because that's when the wall of the first temple was breached. But in the 2nd temple, it was breached on the 17th. So during the 2nd temple period, these fast days must have been annulled. It was during the Babylonian exile, they must have been initiated and annulled during the 2nd temple period. When the temple was destroyed again and Jerusalem was destroyed again, the fast must have been reenacted all over again. But this time it was the 17th of Tammuz and not the 9th. Now the Talmud Rosh Hashanah has an interesting discussion about this. Rav Huna bar Bizna said to Rabbi Shimon Chasida, both of them live in Babylonia. What is the meaning of this verse in Zechariah? It says, thus says the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month, and of the 5th month, and of the 7th month, and the 10th month will become times of gladness and jubilation. It calls it a fast day, then it calls it times of joy and gladness. How is that? Well, when there is peace in the world, there are times of joy and gladness. There's no peace in the world, there are times of fasting. Papa said, this is what it means to say. There's peace in the world and the temple is standing, then there will be times of joy and gladness. When there's persecution and troubles for the Jewish people, then there are times of fasting. However, when there's no persecution for the Jewish people and still not peace, and no particular troubles or consolation for Israel, halacha is as follows. If the people wish, they fast. If they do not wish, they do not fast. So the Talmud says, when the Jews are being persecuted in the diaspora, of course, all the fast days are incumbent upon us. However, if the Jews are living in moderate peace, which means they're not being persecuted, they're being accepted by the countries they are, then the 3 fast days, aside from Tisha B'Av, that's what they'll say after, they can decide whether they want to keep or not. Gemara says, if so, the 9th of Av should also be like the other fast days. Sometimes it's observed and sometimes not, depending on the community. But Papa said, and the 9th of Av is different. Since the calamities that occurred on that day were multiplied, many things happen on the 9th of Av. We actually know more things today that happened on the 9th of Av than in their day. For instance, the expulsion of the Jews of Spain. The edict was given on the 9th of Av in August, 1492. So there are things that happened later that didn't happen in their day. So the 9th of Av is different, he says. And also the city of Beitar was captured on that time, etc. It was stated that the sages disagreed about the following manner. Rav and Rav Chana said, okay, that's another issue. So what do we do today? What is the halacha? In the book called the Tur, Yaakov Turim, which is the predecessor, the forerunner of the Shulchan Aruch, says today where there is no peace, and no evil decrees by the government, if the people want to fast, they fast, meaning the 3 fast days which are not Tisha B'Av. If they don't, they don't. The meaning of no peace is when the temple is destroyed. Beit Yosef writes, who is the author of the Shulchan Aruch, peace means that they're non-Jews, when the non-Jews are not sovereign over Israel. Then there'll be gladness and joy. Okay, so we have 2 interpretations here. Let me explain what that means. The Talmud differentiates between the 9th of Av and the 3 other fast days. The Talmud basically says in times of peace, those 3 other fast days, it depends on the community whether they want to keep them or not. But in times of persecution, we should keep all 4. The Tur brings that down as halakha, that communities can decide whether they want to keep those fast days or not. However, in the Shulchan Aruch, it's already brought down that our sages have decided that this is what we do, and we keep these fast days. But the question is, what is the definition of peaceful times when the fast days will be annulled? Because are you going to say that even when the temple's standing, we have to fast on the 4 fast days over Jerusalem? And does that even make any sense? So Rav Yosef Karo says the definition of peace means there's a Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. But Yaakov Turim says the definition of peace means that the temple is built. Now this is interesting, because according to Joseph Caro, if the definition of peace is that there's a Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, then we shouldn't be fasting at least 3 out of the 4 fast days, because we definitely have a Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. So obviously, Joseph Caro must have followed the Tur on this issue. Excuse me, Joseph Caro also, there's no Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. But I'm saying that the rabbis today in Israel must be following the Tur, because the Tur defines peace as the temple is built, based on the Ramban. Okay, the temple is not built. So if the temple is not built, so we still keep the fast days. However, everybody agrees that when the temple is built, the fast days will be annulled. It is possible that Tisha B'Av will not be because of the other calamities. However, I would think actually that logically, if the temple is built, even Tisha B'Av should be annulled, because our belief is that the calamities all stem from the fact that we lack the temple and Jewish sovereignty. When you're missing the root, all other things can go wrong too. But when you rebuild the root correctly, the other things also find their way. I'm a big believer that anti-Semitism will not be forever. It depends on how the Jews see themselves and then are seen by others. And the first thing we have to do is pull ourselves together. Because if we can't pull ourselves together, well, then nobody's going to pity us. That's just logical. We have to overcome, I call it the Dora Midbar. We're still in the generation of the desert. Everybody's fighting, tribal. We're very, very tribal here in Israel. That's just the way it is. I'm not a psychiatrist to tell you the reason beyond that, but it's definitely tribal. It's not healthy. When we're outside of Israel, we have the luxury of not bumping into other Jews. You know, a secular Jew living in New York never has to see the Jews in Brooklyn or Williamsburg. They never have to see a religious Jew if they don't want to walk into a synagogue. So the Jewish communities outside of Israel, they have a buffer. It's called non-Jews. And these non-Jews being the majority, you never have to see a Jew you don't want to see. So Jews in the diaspora have a luxury. You don't have to even try to get along with them. In Israel, we don't have that luxury. We all live on the same ship. We might be on different levels of the ship, in different cabins, but we're definitely on the same ship. So if somebody's going to put a hole in the floor, everybody's going to notice it. So we don't have the luxury not to get along. That's the difference in the land of Israel. I'll tell you another secret. If the Jews in Israel did not get along, all diaspora Jews would be at risk. I know the Jews in America think they're supporting Israel, and where would Israel be without the American lobby and American money, etc. But at this point, it's probably the reverse. The state of Israel is basically, if you want to put it, the insurance policy of every Jew who's on the planet today. And if the state was not here, then anti-Semitism would be much worse than it is today. And when the day comes when there are 30 million Jews living in the land of Israel and we're more or less getting along, I think that's when anti-Semitism will stop. That's my personal feeling. Because the state of Israel brings us back to the stage of history. Rabbi Leon Ashkenazi was Algerian-born rabbi, moved to France, and at the end of his life came to Israel, Yehuda Ashkenazi. And he once said, outside of Israel, a Jew can be cosmopolitan, meaning you can feel that you're part of the greater world and have jet-set friends in Monaco or whatever you want. But you'll never be universalist. Because when Freud discovered psychotherapy, wasn't Freud the Jew, it was Freud. When Einstein discovered theories in physics, it was just Einstein, it wasn't the Jewish people. But when a Jewish Israeli, wins a Nobel Prize for whatever, it's the state of Israel won a Nobel Prize. When Mark Spitz got, 9 gold medals, it was Mark Spitz who got 9 gold medals. But when an Israeli got a gold medal in the Olympics for the first one was windsurfing or something like that, and then another guy got for judo, that was the state of Israel. That's called entering the world stage of history again. I know it's hard for Israelis to understand that. It's easier for people like me who are born out of Israel to appreciate things like that. And I'm hoping that everybody will appreciate that one day and understand the importance of what's happening here. It's not always easy to be here, but it's very meaningful. And we still have choppy times, but when you bring in new people, I've always said to classes of people converting, we need you to take the place of self-hating Jews. to bring a new spirit. So some guy once said to me, "Don't worry, in a couple of years there'll be self-hating Jews also." But hopefully not. So it's important to have people who can look at the state of Israel and the Jewish people after 40 and 50 years and still feel inspired. That's a special thing. I knew this woman here in Jerusalem was a friend of my mother's going back for years. She was a big Zionist. And even after living in Israel for 35 years, she was a big Zionist. It didn't go stale. She was always able to remember what her life was without Israel and to appreciate the fact that she was here. Sometimes when you don't have something, you appreciate it more. I think sometimes every Israeli should spend 5 years in another country and then come back. And then when you look at things from a distance, then you forget all your struggles and you appreciate little things sometimes that maybe you did not see before, because this country was much more difficult in the 60s and the 70s. Really, really difficult. When I flew to New York City, and on the plane, there was an El Al plane. I hadn't flown El Al for years because I was going to Canada, and it was difficult with El Al. So this fellow says, "Can I sit on your?" There's like there are empty seats. He wanted to sit in the seat next to me, like one next to me. I said, "Okay." He says, "I need a little open space." He says to me. He says, "Why do you need open space?" He says, "I get claustrophobia because of shell shock." I said, "When did you have shell shock?" He says, "It was the Yom Kippur War." Yom Kippur War. Now you have to understand this is a long time ago. That's 1973, Yom Kippur War. So we're talking a little bit, and he tells me a story. He's living in Far Rockaway in New York, but in the Yom Kippur War, he had made Aliyah from Tunisia, and he was asked by one of the generals, Meir Dagan, to be part of a special group where they would go behind enemy lines and just start shooting at random the Egyptian soldiers. That's it. And they had this like 2 weeks of training to do this. And by the way, it was a suicide commission. It was a suicide mission, but they were not asked if they would do it. It was different times in Israel. Suicide mission. He said for 2 weeks they prepared. At the last minute, the general got a call from Ariel Sharon, who at the time was in charge of the southern forces, and he called off the operation, not to do it. So then they placed him in some place in the Sinai, and when he was placed in the Sinai, so he had this group, and things were very difficult in the Yom Kippur War. They were shot at by a plane coming from Egypt, and he was on a machine gun, so he tried to use his machine gun against the plane. Machine gun got stuck because of the sand. So he said to a friend of his, "You shoot at the plane." So the guy got out of his dugout and tried to shoot at the plane, but the plane hit him and killed him. And this guy said to me, from that moment on, he felt guilty that he had killed this guy because he told him to leave the dugout in order to shoot at the plane. And then he was killed by the plane. He said he couldn't deal with it after that. During the war, he said a few times he tried to walk in front of enemy fire to kill himself, but it just didn't happen. Either somebody would pull him back or whatever. And then after the war, he went to the United States, brought up a family, got married, but never got over it. Says sometimes he has difficulty breathing. He gets all these episodes where never. It was a harder times then, living in the state of Israel. When I first came to Israel, it took 5 years to get a telephone. And it wasn't cheap because if you wanted to call the United States, we had this thing called asimonim telephone tokens. If you didn't have a telephone, there were these tokens you would put in. So I first came to Israel, this guy, we were in Netanya with my parents, and I wanted to call something Canada. So you put in these tokens and they go down really fast. You put another one, because it was really expensive to call North America. You got to put like 20 tokens at a time on the phone. And it was a different world at that time, a different time. And when you look back, you appreciate it. And sometimes when you only see Israel now, you don't appreciate how far we've come. You only look at what we're missing, and you don't look at what we have achieved. So sometimes that's also important. Okay, this is basically what I wanted to say. I know some of the people are going to the Beit Din on Tuesday. I wish you Hatzlacha. I think there's when are we having the party officially? Anybody remember? I can't even remember. Okay. Well, I always say to people, don't party until you pass. It's like
Right.
when it happens, that's when it will happen. If it doesn't happen the first time, it will happen the second time. People who are being ignored by Vadat Charigim, it'll happen too. Eventually, we'll get on their case and they'll give you the Ishur and you'll go to the Beit Din also. So it's just a matter of a few weeks this way, a few weeks that way. That's really all it's about. And you have to present yourselves as best as you can at the Beit Din, because remember, they only have 30 minutes to figure you out. They do have all your letters. You don't have to remind them about the letters. They do, unless you think they forgot. But in general, they look at the letters. They look at the online Chavad Da'at. Is there somebody who doesn't have their online Chavad Da'at done yet for Tuesday? Was there somebody who maybe you wouldn't even know? Okay, I'll try to find out. When we write the evaluation for the Beit Din online, I think for most of the people we already did it, maybe even all the people. And okay, so I wish everybody Hatzlacha, and may this be significant Tisha B'Av, and may soon Tisha B'Av be abolished and become days of happiness and jubilation for all the people of Israel and all the Jews around the world. And maybe the whole world will be a little bit of a better place at that time too. Thank
Thank you so much.
תודה רבה.